and related concepts. Today's event is structured as a panel discussion. Dr. Jennifer Lilly, who is an assistant professor at Fordham University in the Graduate School of Social Services, will moderate this discussion. Our four panelists, including Dr. Lilly, are all graduates of the Mellon Program. They will discuss their personal stories and present a critical reflection on their doctoral work and their Mellon community engaged projects. The presentations will be followed by a discussion, and we will conclude our time today with a Q&A session. We will be able to either use the chat box if you have any questions, so feel free to type there, or at the end we will be able to kind of talk together in a nice informal discussion. So I will now pass it to Dr. Lilly, who will introduce our panelists and also the Mellon Program.
Thank you, Anna. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm Jen, and I'm an alumni of the Mellon Program, which is a graduate program for community engaged scholarship. And today you're going to be hearing from a couple of alumni from this program in what will hopefully be, kind of an educational and inspirational forum that will allow you to have a better understanding of how the Mellon Program supports us in really becoming innovators in our field by using these community engagement practices to kind of push the boundaries of what constitutes scholarship or knowledge production and what that might look like. So the program, just so you know, is currently recruiting until May 15th for graduate student fellows, as well as community fellows and faculty fellows. So if you're interested in getting involved, this will be a great way to learn more about what some of the folks who have gone through the program have been working on and how that connects to our scholarship and future careers. So we're going to be hearing today from Theo Hilton, who is in social cultural anthropology, from Caleb Smith, who is in the history department here at Tulane, and also from Megan Flatley, who is in art history and Latin American studies. And I was a part of the city culture and community program at Tulane. So we have a wide range of kind of liberal arts fields represented, which is exactly what the Mellon Program is geared towards, is people working kind of at the intersections of humanities and other fields. So I'm going to share a little bit about my project to begin. And my project really began, I have not so much slides as images, which I'm a very image-based person. So we'll get this started. But my project, which is entitled Alta Voces, really began within the social innovation field. I worked with Dr. Laura Murphy in the Taylor Center and took courses around social innovation for graduate students as I was conceptualizing this project, which really helped me to incorporate some of those mindsets into my approach, using design thinking with my program participants to really get their input and gather their feedback on how they wanted this project to unfold. I think there are a lot of overlaps between, social innovation and community engagement practices in terms of being, human or community centered, really focusing on the product, really focusing on the process just as much, if not more so, than the end product. And then cultivating these different mindsets or approaches to understanding social problems. So, the focus, each one of us, I think, is going to focus our discussions a little bit differently. But for me, one of the questions I get frequently asked by people interested in Mellon is around kind of the connection between my Mellon work and my own scholarship. And so within, these kind of design thinking mindsets, how might we questions are posed quite often. So the how might we question I kind of had in mind for what I'm going to present is, how might we center community in our academic work? And conversely, how might knowledge production sort of flow from our community work? So that's really the basis of where my talk is going to go. So my project, I'm going to give a brief overview of what it was, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about kind of the interconnections between that project and my dissertation and current work. So I worked with a group of Latino youth here in New Orleans through a community organization called Puentes. And I involved them, from the beginning in designing what kind of project or program they might want to be a part of. And we use design thinking. Here they're making kind of an affinity diagram. We used those processes to help us, collaboratively design this project. So Puentes was the partner I worked with as my Mellon community partner. And I became really close with this group of youth who were a part of a youth organizing initiative there. So in the first year of my Mellon program, I really didn't conduct a project at all. I spent time building relationships and embedding myself within this organization, gaining the trust and building rapport with these participants, and using these kind of design thinking processes and brainstorming techniques to understand what might be, most desirable or beneficial from their perspectives. And we had this idea that we wanted to use, digital media and storytelling as a part of the youth organizing that these young people were engaged in. So eventually we conceived of the idea of conducting a couple of workshops to really give them the hands-on skills to use digital media to document their stories and share them with the world in order to, invoke human empathy and garner action around the issues that are really important in their personal experiences. So these workshops really focused on, giving them hands-on skill building opportunities, getting their hands on cameras, which my Mellon funding was able to provide and donate to the organization. I had the young gentleman you see here was actually a youth member of the program who co-led these workshops with me. So the youth were very involved in every part of the process. Eventually that culminated in us, the youth recording one another's stories, interviewing each other and using kind of what we did was in the vein of testimonio, kind of storytelling traditions in Latin America that are centered around social justice. And then eventually editing their own stories into things that could be publicly shared with audiences. Here you see one of the participants presenting at the Imagining America conference 2 Octobers ago. It's been a while. So that's kind of the gist of what my Mellon project involved, but it didn't really stop there. Fast forward a few months, years, somewhere in that time frame later, and this became the basis of my dissertation research. And obviously there were quite a lot of steps in between, but that's what I want to talk about for the rest of my time here, is really emphasizing kind of how my Mellon project led into my dissertation and how from both a community and a research standpoint, that really strengthened my ability to do my academic work. So there's 4 main things I want to touch on that working with the Mellon program in this way allowed me to kind of bring into my continued research with this group of young people. And the first is really building that long-term relationship. So Mellon allowed me to work with this population, with this organization for a full 2 years before I even conducted my dissertation research with them. And that was really important, obviously, when working with any type of vulnerable community, like youth and like immigrant youth, many of whom were undocumented. That's extremely important to building the trust that is needed and to really understanding issues from their perspectives and being sensitive around issues of equity and ethics. And from a research standpoint, of course, that's a strategy that increases methodological rigor, right? Like having this prolonged engagement with the community or population that you're researching helps build trustworthiness and credibility into your end research product. So it has a dual function there. My Mellon project working with these youth also functioned really as kind of an exploratory study that allowed me to further refine my research questions. So learning their stories, getting to know the issues that they cared about, that was really vital to me understanding, what were the issues that we needed to know more about? What do we need to produce knowledge around? What is really pertinent from the perspective of these young people? And how can I encapsulate that in what I'm trying to do in my research agenda? It also functioned as like a feasibility study. So the methodology that I used in my dissertation ultimately stemmed out of my Mellon project. I used participatory digital media. I involved youth in doing testimonial storytelling and in editing their own, analyzing and editing the narratives that we produced out of this. And so there were a lot of challenges I experienced, positive challenges that I experienced during the Mellon program that then allowed me to sort of tailor the process differently to better respond to kind of the circumstances and the needs of the participants, ultimately making my dissertation possible. And then finally is the funding, right? Having the support from Mellon to really engage in this long-term project wouldn't have been possible without the funding that I received. And that really allowed me to build sustainability into this work by donating the equipment purchased to the organization so that the youth can continue to use these methods of storytelling in the work that they're doing. And, part of the reason why I came into academia is to try and redistribute resources from the university to the community. And I think Mellon is a perfect example of that. I was able to give the youth stipends for participating in every step of the way because of the flexibility of the funding mechanism that Mellon provides, and involve them in the budgeting process, which was, I think, a really powerful experience for them to have their voices included in how we distribute the available resources that we had. So those are kind of the areas I wanted to touch on, mainly because I get asked questions a lot about how we make those connections, both from students and faculty alike, who are interested in potentially, how do I use these community engagement practices in a way that also contributes to my research agenda. And I think there's a lot of value in doing things in this way and forming these long-term relationships to ultimately have a greater and more meaningful impact in terms of the knowledge that we are producing. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Theo to share about his project.
Sure, thanks, Jen. I'm going to start my little timer right here. And give the caveat that I said to folks as we were getting ready for this event to begin, which is that I'm in very sleep deprived childcare and second COVID shot brain, both things I'm really excited about, but are consuming a lot of my bandwidth. So I want to start out with a quote from somebody who I think is one of the most important scholars working in the United States today, which is geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And she does a lot of engaged, I would say fundamentally, really impressively engaged work with folks who, most of her work, her book Golden Gulag, is working with people who are doing anti-carceral activism in Los Angeles and people who are directly impacted and related to people who have been incarcerated. And she says, first offers this question: how can people who inhabit forgotten places, and so she's describing people who live in carceral landscapes, scale up their activism from intensely localized struggles to something less atomized and therefore possessed of a significant capacity for self-determination? Which I think is a great question. I think if we're thinking about what are questions that we're going to try to engage with our engaged research and our social innovation, a great one to lock into. And she says, here's where scholars can make a difference. Not because we have technical expertise, although that matters, but rather because we have the precious opportunity to think in cross-cutting ways and to find both promising continuities and productive breaks in the mix of people, histories, political and economic forces, and landscapes that make up forgotten places. And I really like that. I like that because it sort of, this quote to me foregrounds the idea that, we're coming from a place where we have a particular set of knowledges that we're accessing, a particular set of frameworks that we're operating through, and that's the resources that we have, along with, as Jen so rightly pointed out, the cash resources and material resources that we can offer to activism that's happening and to political movements. And to me, I think that that's, as I said before, kind of the thing. I'm going to talk a little bit about my project and how it didn't quite go as planned and how it relates to my dissertation work, and that's going to probably take the whole amount of time. So my Mellon project, I worked with an organization called Jane Place Neighborhood Sustainability Initiative. And I want to talk a little bit about why I chose to work with them. And it was this. It's because it was because they're an organization that's based in the neighborhood in New Orleans where I live, Mid-City, that was founded by their founding executive director, Shana Griffin, as somebody who grew up in public housing in New Orleans and then saw the demolition of public housing, both physically and just in terms of something that's funded and exists and is thought of as a social good over the course of her life. And her and people she was politically engaged with started Jane Place as a way to think about providing decommodified, permanently affordable housing that really emphasized the ability of people who have lived in New Orleans for a long time to remain in place in spite of the sort of active and violent urban renewal processes that in Mid-City have involved the biomedical corridor, which if you've read anything from Mike Fitz recently, you'll know that Tulane is really invested in. And so, I was really interested in working with this group because on the sort of that level, the level of who they were and the politics that they embodied really resonated for me. And so as Jen describes, and as I think is really important and something to consider for people who a lot of the time are just in town for 6 years, 5 years doing their PhD, the possibility for building relationships is something that happens on a much faster scale. And so, this organization, before I had started working with the Mellon Program, was one that I just had been interested in. I had become a member of, I had been supporting. And so those were relationships that I sort of begun to organically build already in a place that I was putting some effort. And so then, when I had the opportunity, I was accepted into the Mellon Program. I thought about ways that I could collaborate with them in new ways. And, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore describes, bring different kinds of resources and different kinds of, frankly, time that I have access and capacity to contribute to their work to help, scale up and help them, do new things and do their work in a more effective way and help move it forward. So, the way that I approached putting together the project was also really straightforward. I just talked to the people who run Jane Place and asked if there was anything that they wanted to do that they didn't have capacity for. And they had a lot of things, unsurprisingly, they really didn't have capacity for, as with many under-resourced organizations that have a really strong vision and not a lot of money. So the thing that was sort of the most pressing at the time was trying to figure out this thing, and maybe folks who were in town will remember the American Can Company evicted all of their low-income tenants on Christmas Day in 2018, I believe. And it set off this set of questions for people doing housing advocacy in New Orleans, which was what happened and how could that happen again? And what had happened was they had a sunset clause on their low-income units that the developers were able to get out of through sort of a backdoor loophole. And we realized that this was potentially going to happen for a lot of housing developments that came online directly after Katrina. An American Can Company had come online before Katrina, and so we thought this might happen in the future. So what I ended up doing was working with them to develop a resource that would help tenants who were concerned about the possibility of being evicted because of their low-income units ceasing to exist know what might be coming down the pipeline and how to prepare for it and what to do about it. And we realized, and so this involved doing a lot of conveyance records research, and basically just spent hours and hours and hours in the CBD at the city office for conveyance records, looking into this, with the intent of, in line with the Mellon sort of project vision of having some events to share this information, of making some publications and a website. And we realized when we got really into the research that actually a corollary thing could happen, which was once we produced that data, developers who are interested in finding a loophole to get out of providing their low-income units would use it. So that sort of foreclosed the idea of this public-facing work, so this database exists and it's useful, and it's used in their organizing, and it's a big part of it, and it's maintained through this relationship and through the resources that come from the Mellon Program. But we had to really say goodbye to that vision of using it in this public-facing thing. And I think that I share that anecdote to say, wow, time goes by really fast. I should share that anecdote to say that that in pivoting away from having that deliverable that we initially had started with, I realized that what we were doing together was a lot bigger than a particular deliverable or bigger than a particular thing that was going to come out of that relationship. And we really had to rethink that interaction to be like, how are we operating together in an accountable way moving forward, which is something I'd be really excited to talk about in the chat in just a minute. But I think that, I guess I just want to conclude by saying, as I've thought about social innovation in this whole construct and social innovation where it fits into the work that we do, as fellows in the Mellon program, I think it really comes down to translation for me. And it comes down to, and inspired by what Ruth Wilson Gilmore is saying, it comes down to saying like, look, I am in this framework where I spend all my time writing like academic grants and learning about the Taylor Center and all these initiatives that exist through Tulane and these things that I've, whatever, this world that I'm navigating in. And how can I translate the interest of those programs and translate the, benchmarks of those programs into things that actually make sense for grassroots work? And I could really be very interested in talking about, the contradistinction between grassroots work and NGO work, and how those things are variously visible and invisible to programs like the ones that we often work with here. And I would love for somebody to ask me a question about that later. So thank you for bearing with me. Moving on to Caleb.
All right, good morning. Kevin Smith, PhD candidate in the history department at Tulane. I am also an alumni of the Mellon Fellowship in this inaugural fall 2017 class. My partnership and project while in the Mellon Fellowship was with the Ashe Cultural Arts Center, which is a Black cultural arts center located in Central City, New Orleans. There I was able to find a practical means of placing conventional scholarship into the community through programming. Community events, various, but two stick out the most. During my tenure with Ashe, we had featured diasporic art exhibits featuring countries such as Senegal and Ghana. The last event was in 2019, was Taste of Africa, which was a cross-campus collaboration between the Xavier, Tulane, and the Mellon Fellowship that included African dance from Xavier's Performing Arts Department, African cuisine from Tulane's African Student Association. So since officially completing the Mellon Fellowship Program in 2019, I've sustained a relationship with the Mellon Foundation for the last 2 years. Collaboration with the Mellon Fellowship includes sponsoring of community speakers for the topics of community engagement, service learning course, and CPS's CACS Academy, which is the first year seminar on social justice. Overall, my Mellon experience doesn't correlate directly to my dissertation work, primarily because my dissertation topic was not established during the time that I was a Mellon Fellow. However, it did allow me to gain valuable program management and planning skills within the community. More importantly, the program allowed me to learn about cultural arts and an interdisciplinary structure. Thank you. Megan, with Megan.
Okay. Yes, hi everyone. So as Jen mentioned, I am in the Joint Art History and Latin American Studies PhD program. Let me just start my timer so I don't go over time. And so for my 2-year Mellon Fellowship, I worked with the Newcomb Art Museum on the exhibition Persister. I'm going to talk about in just a second. But first, I just kind of wanted to give a little bit of context, which is to say that art history can be an incredibly elitist discipline. And so for a lot of reasons that I don't have time to go into. But so I have photos here of our own New Orleans Museum of Art to just kind of give a sense of the way that fine arts museums can be very imposing. So this kind of classical, neoclassical facade out front, the white walls, the gilded frames. Art museums can have a lot of barriers to entry in terms of class, or if you don't have experience kind of engaging in these spaces, and it can be quite alienating. And so right now, in the last few years, the museum world has been having, kind of this huge reckoning over, museum collections origins in colonialism, in the really grotesque lack of diversity in terms of artists represented in collections. So there's an ongoing protest movement at a lot of the big encyclopedic museums in New York City, calls to decolonize collections, to repatriate objects. And so all of this is to say that, museums are changing a little bit, and there's really exciting conversation happening right now and space to talk about new practices. So, like I said, I partnered with the Newcomb Art Museum, which is the Tulane University Art Museum. And this is a small, university-based museum. So it is very different than, say, a large encyclopedic museum like NOMA. But for the last 5 or 6 years, the Newcomb Art Museum has been doing a lot of really exciting exhibitions along the lines of social change, social justice issues. So these are just a couple examples from the last few years, but I think most shows that Newcomb has been doing in the last few years, there's a lot to learn in terms of more community-driven curatorial practices. So Persister, the exhibition was up for 6 months in 2019. And the exhibition, addressed the issue of mass incarceration in Louisiana, a state that is frequently the incarceration capital of the world. So the exhibition at its base, the museum partnered with 2 New Orleans-based organizations, Operation Restoration and Women with a Vision. And to create kind of the artistic content for the exhibition, the museum staff and myself, we interviewed 30 formerly incarcerated women. And then those women were partnered with an artist of their choosing, and then the museum commissioned that artist to create a new artwork based on the woman's story, and that became the material for the exhibition. So this is fairly radical for an art exhibition, in my experience at least. And this gets back to, again, this very elitist notion of the curator as somebody who has expert aesthetic knowledge, and the kind of the position that the curator frequently plays. So because this is an issue that is so critical, to the New Orleans community, the museum partnered with community members. So Sarita Stibe and Dolphinette Martin are both formerly incarcerated women and incredibly prominent and powerful organizers on the issue of decarceration in New Orleans. And they were complete partners in the development of the exhibition. And then we also hosted various events at different stages of the planning of the exhibition. We held frequent partner brunches to create a space where the persisters, as we came to call them, the women who participated, members, representatives of the many organizations that we worked with, the artists, museum staff could come together and reflect on the process of developing, the exhibition themes, the research that was generated for this exhibition, and a number of other things. And this aspect of collaboration was also present in a lot of the art itself. So many of the artists elected to collaborate with their persister in the actual creation of their art object itself. So this is just a photograph of Anastasia Pelias's artist statement, where she describes how she brought Sarita into the making of this object. And again, this is innovative curatorial practice. This is not something, and because it's innovative, it required a different sense of, for example, artist contracts. So the community partners insisted that these works couldn't be sold without the woman's consent, and that a percentage of the sale would go to the woman, so that these artists or the museum more generally weren't profiting off of the sharing of these women's stories. There's also, so because this was an exhibition around a social issue rather than a more traditional art exhibition, say around, similar stylistic tendencies or, a certain artist group, there was a lot of data and context that we wanted to include. So one of the ways we did that was we had a history of mass incarceration timeline that ran along the floor of the exhibition. The museum also commissioned the artist Tasleem Van Houten to make these really incredible graphics. And this is another, I think, really innovative curatorial practice to center context and to center, this data and this information almost on an equal footing with the actual art objects themselves. With the exhibition, we also wanted to invite collaboration with visitors and with community members also. So one of the ways we did that was the timeline at the end of the exhibition actually comes up the wall to form this tree that you see on the left, where we included recent reform legislation that had passed in Louisiana. and also encouraged visitors to write their own dates on leaves, things that either weren't represented in the timeline or personal dates. And then they were invited to place them on the tree to contribute to the creation of the narrative. We also had this floating envelope installation where visitors were able to write notes to the persisters and to currently incarcerated women that at the end of the exhibition, we scanned all of these messages and sent them to the women as a way to kind of manifest this dialogue that the exhibition was trying to create between those for whom incarceration is a distant issue and those for whom it's very close. And then lastly, so in terms of sustainability, this was something that the museum wanted to ensure that this wasn't, kind of a one-off. And so the museum committed to hosting 3 exhibitions over the course of the next 10 years that deal with the issue of incarceration in the New Orleans community. So the next iteration, they're already working on it. It's going to center on the issue of juvenile incarceration, and I think is slated for like 2022. But also the exhibition has traveled. So after it was shown at the Uptown Gallery, it was shown at the Downtown Dibble Gallery in New Orleans. It then went to the Ford Foundation Gallery in New York. And next it's traveling to Michigan. So that's one of the ways in which we tried to build sustainability into this project. And I will just say, in terms of questions, this is not my dissertation research. So within the art history field, you're kind of expected to have certain museum experience, have done certain curatorial work to prepare you to possibly do this work upon completion. But my actual, art history dissertation is on a Mexican muralism in the 1920s. So this was something that at times was difficult because it felt very separate from trying to push my dissertation topic forward. So I just wanted to offer that that's my perspective. So if we want to address that in the Q&A later. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you all. So I think I'm turning it over to Dr. Murphy for comments.
Thank you. Thank you all. This was really, really great projects, and it's really nice to see all the pictures and hear all those, all the insights. And I have a few slides to share because I've got a very short, in a sense, more of a kind of a framing of thinking about what we've been hearing about the presenters' projects and what social innovation is and what community engaged scholarship is. So I'm going to try to share my screen. Well, actually, I will achieve it. The question is how effectively here. Wait, not yet. Okay, so I'm starting like you all, trying to figure out the bigger conversation is around how social innovation and community engaged scholarship are related. And I'm assuming you can, Jen, you can see my slides, right? Yeah. So I've been working in and on and around social innovation, and as Anna Manhatova mentioned in the beginning, we're really about supporting researchers and scholarship as ways for students and faculty and anyone really to get involved in change making. And social innovation is a pretty big field. So I'm going to try to connect research in social innovation with community engaged scholarship. And I have visuals, so you guys can tell me if I'm getting it right. So community engaged scholarship, as I understand it, is really centered in the academy or grounded in the academy. And it's a perspective from the academy and focus on public humanities and liberal arts. And reviewing the Mellon Foundation, the scholars' websites, you're all from liberal arts disciplines, from art and music and Latin American studies and anthropology and CCC and history. And then a bunch of methods of narrative therapy, ethnographies, different methods with the goals of public service and public humanities. And then on the bottom, I put a bunch of words, which I then changed as I listened to you. So I put center and community, listening to Jen, and activism, listen to Theo, and different topics here. So it's about bringing the academy to bear in relation to community. And social innovation is a big field that looks at civil society, public sphere, and academia with some couple different competing definitions of social entrepreneurship leading to social innovations that solve problems, or more recently, new configurations of social relations, something very different because there are different perspectives on the world and how change happens. And so I just put some research methods in a kind of liberal model of positivist approaches and impact evaluation. And then in a more post-structural, post-colonial world, we're looking at different ways of producing knowledge, right? So I'm going to jump forward and say, given this perspective on research and social innovation, then how do these things relate? This is just very provisional, but I'm thinking that there's very clear overlap in the area of new configurations of social relations in terms of understanding the world as sets of relationships among people and actors, and trying to build those relationships and really change the way we operate, not just develop a venture that's sustainable, which may be relevant, but really rethinking how we work together. So I just wanted to put that out in front, and then if there's a question, it's like, does this make sense to you? That's one question I'm just going to put out for you to hang on to. And then a second question is, where does the money come from? You know, like we're all laundering, or a better idea is we are conversion projects for turning money from exploitation of people on earth through foundations and philanthropy into something different. And Andrew Mellon's money came from aluminum, steel, oil, petrochemicals, and banking. And now it's being turned into this terrific work you're doing. And the Taylor Center money comes from the Taylor Energy and Phyllis Taylor's work in trying to promote education. We're all converting these funds into something different. So where does money fit into your work? Are we paying enough attention to where the money's going? And how might that shape your futures, your careers, and your research? I'll stop sharing. So that's it. This kind of more of a commentary with a couple questions. And I think that you're just supposed to hang on to those things. And then we hear from Lily. And then that gets us into the discussion at the end. Does that sound right?
That sounds right. Yes.
Okay.
Thanks, Dr. Murphy.
Sure.
Yeah, I know we're all just kind of scratching the surface here in the limited amount of time we have, but we're definitely excited to engage with what questions you all have. I think the questions that Dr. Murphy posed are great ways to kind of frame how we bring these two fields together, and what overlaps we might see, and what challenges we might, collectively face in the future. But yeah, I think we're going to take a question from Lillian Lombera, and also if folks want to drop questions in the chat, or or you can use the raise hand feature, and I can kind of try and moderate that way.
Hello, congratulations to all of you. So I have some questions, not specific for anybody, but if you resonate with that. Can you identify personal and or professional insights that were directly linked to your Mellon experience, or to put it another way, did you find something unexpected in your Mellon project that changed the questions of your research or the perspective? And how has your Mellon project shifted the trajectory of your initial dissertation plan? I know Jen talked a little about that. And what advice do you have for future Mellon fellows or merging the Mellon project and dissertation? And third, did you share your research findings in some way with the community you work with? How do you manage the inside-outside positions to keep analytical distance as researcher while the whole involvement in the community engagement? Thank you.
Great. Yeah, did any of my colleagues, so I just dropped those questions into the chat if anyone wants to refer back to them. Lillian had prepared these in advance and sent them to us earlier. So yeah, I want to see if Megan, Theo, or Caleb want to jump in here first.
I can speak to the first question just really briefly, which is to say, yeah, my Mellon project really shifted the way that I approach my dissertation project and research generally. And spoke a little bit when I was talking to the pivot from this initial focus on a deliverable that was going to be this whole project, and we figured out what it was, and there's going to be an event and a book and etc. Booklet, zine, what have you, website. And when we didn't do that, there was some time of, I think for me, a little bit adjusting from this mentality of saying, okay, my work is to identify this sort of linear process of political movement, and it's going to look a particular way, and it's going to be kind of simple. I think oftentimes we're really pushed to think about things as being like, this is this group, this is their politics, this is what they want to do, and this is how we're going to get there. And my dissertation research also focuses on grassroots political activism. And it's really challenging. It's really challenging to move forward. It's really challenging to figure out, you know, in any context, what people collectively want and what movement on that looks like, what success looks like. A lot of the time doesn't really look, you know, that successful when you're thinking about environmental justice struggles in Plaquemines Parish, which is where I do a lot of my work. I mean, the successes are hard to find. And so I think through my Mellon project and kind of shifting the way that I thought about that, and then simultaneously shifting the way that I understood social, like grassroots environmental justice movements, the more I thought, my job here is to be in relationship with people. My job here is to help move projects forward when it makes sense, and to listen and provide ideas, but it's not really to document sort of a pat forward moving narrative or fix something or, you know, have an easy solution to all the world's problems, because that just fundamentally doesn't exist. And I think a lot of times in spaces like Tulane, especially post-Katrina, and we're going to see it a lot post-COVID, we're going to be really pushed to think about how our innovation is going to save the world. And it's fundamentally not.
Thanks, Theo. Yeah, Caleb, did you want to respond to the same question or something else?
Same one.
Okay, great. Yeah, go ahead.
All right. Look at the first question. I definitely saw professional and personal insights, specifically coming from the standpoint of a conventional historian. Oftentimes, this is not the most attractive discipline for students. So working with the Black Culture Arts Center, Ashe Culture Arts Center, I was able to see, you know, how to place these things, these people in attractive settings and actually still preserve history in itself through murals, through exhibits, through pavilions, all these things. And when I actually brought students to Ashe Culture Arts Center, they seem to have a deeper connection with these issues.
Thanks, Caleb. Megan, did you want to respond to that same question as well, or we can move on to the next one?
I will tackle a next question.
Great. Yeah, why don't we, thanks. Yeah, I think Caleb and Theo shared some really important insights around that. I think, you know, Mellon ultimately shifted our perspectives. That's part of the goal of the program, right? Is to shift our perspective in terms of the way we think about what constitutes knowledge production and who should be involved in that process. And I think all of our work really speaks to that. But yeah, let's shift to kind of the question around how your Mellon connects or disconnects or changed your dissertation plans. So I kind of spoke to this already, but it's also, you know, your Mellon project does not by any means have to be your dissertation project. That's just one way of approaching it. But I think that in any case, it enriches our scholarship activities in different ways, right? So did anyone have a response that they want to kind of put out there for that? Yeah, Caleb.
Well, like I said in my initial introduction presentation, my Mellon experience doesn't directly correlate with my dissertation project, but in a broader scheme, it adds to my second field, which is the African diaspora. So it gave me another avenue of placing my competency, but also the institution as a whole, as a graduate student, allowed me to see careers outside of the academy. And how could you use this information? Because oftentimes we know that the job market is grim, and tenure track jobs are hard to come by. So, but it still was a very welcoming institution that you could still see that your studies and culture was still not only being preserved but appreciated.
Yeah, just to pick up on what Caleb was saying, yes, Persister I'm not writing my dissertation on Persister, but my dissertation is thinking about how art has been employed, in struggles for social change historically. And that's kind of what the central theme that all my work revolves around. But I do think, to be frank, like that the Mellon program has given me a lot in terms of yeah, as Caleb said, confidence in tackling this horrible academic job market that we're faced with. You know, I would love to still get a tenure track position, but I feel, I guess, more fluid and more flexible in terms of my skills when it comes to, you know, doing community-based arts work, things that a PhD in art history does not prepare you for. Aspects of, yeah, this is not preparation that I would get, I don't think, at any art history program in the country without the Mellon program. And so that's something that I'm taking with me for sure.
I want to echo both of those things and maybe add something that's perhaps a self-serving comment, but maybe useful, which is that I think when we meaningfully spend time thinking about how we value knowledge production outside of the academy and value ways of knowing that exist outside of the academy, the more we can imagine ourselves as part of that, right? And imagine our futures outside of the academy because it's meaningfully important to us. So I think that's something I would include. And I think also, yeah, I mean, just working in spaces that aren't academic spaces is really useful for making our knowledge, you know, or making our interests worthwhile for other people who aren't ourselves. The other thing that I'll say is I think that my Mellon project really helped me get over some of my angst about doing social research. I think because of my politics and because of, you know, my sense of the colonial history of the academy and very much the colonial history of anthropology, I was quite hesitant to do any like research because I was just like, this is exploitative inherently and horrible. And I think that, you know, I'm not that important. So the process of building relationships and doing something together and learning how to just be above board about what's happening was really valuable. And I would encourage everybody to try to get over that existential angst about doing your dissertation project as fast as you can, because you're ultimately going to do it.
Yeah, I would just add quickly, I think what Theo said is really well phrased, because I think having that distance from the academy, it just also makes me a better scholar. It helps me see structures and relationships and the, you know, the very constructed nature of my fields and of museum collections in ways that it would certainly take me longer to get there, I think, if I wasn't also in conversation with folks outside the academy. So thank you for that, Theo.
Yeah, I want to echo that as well. Theo's comments really made me think about how I conceive of my role as a new tenure track faculty member. And I really try to conceptualize it as a public scholar. And I think that that's something that my experience in Mellon helped me cultivate that mindset. And there's definitely always going to be those tensions. And I think those tensions are places where I can grow and where hopefully I can bring others with me in the academy to grow and to think about, you know, I think it's helped me think about the impact of my research on a more, what I call meaningful level, you know, beyond what is typically considered the boxes we want to check within academia in terms of peer review and publishing for scholarly, you know, academic audiences. And so really trying to be an advocate also within the academy to change some of those structures while acknowledging, you know, the problematics of existing within that space. Caleb, did you have something else you wanted to share on this too?
I was thinking that, you know, community engagement and specifically the Mellon program is the commonplace between the academy and the community. What I mean by that is oftentimes the academy has a certain structure or way of doing things, a certain professionalism that is seen throughout departments, whether, you know, you send an email, you expect it to be 24 to 48 hours. But in actuality, community engagement doesn't work like that sometimes. It forces you to be flexible. It forces you to use different avenues of communication or basically meeting someone at a common point to where you can actually have a collaborative and mutually beneficial goal.
I guess let's move on to, did anyone have a response to the third question, kind of around sharing your research findings or managing sort of the insider outsider positions?
I don't believe in analytical distance. I want to say it. I've said it before and people have been like, well, what's the point of a university? And I think that's a stupid question. You know, picking up on the quote that I gave at the beginning of my talk from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, I think that our best role as academics is to amplify political efforts and figure out how they make resonance across space, across time, and across, you know, a whole number of experiences. And I think that that doesn't require analytical distance. It requires bringing our own analytical frameworks to work in support of those visions. And I think, yeah, absolutely, that work is meaningless if the people who you're working with can't access it. For me, that looks like, you know, reviewing, I mean, so far I'm early in my dissertation phase, but it looks like reviewing interviews with people who I've spoken with and talking about them afterwards. You know, my work is very policy oriented, and it's about Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality and EPA programs recognizing the importance of settlements, free people settlements that continue to exist today along the Mississippi River. So there's a lot of work in terms of like amplifying those communities' experiences in the policy realm, but also helping people like piece together a comprehensive documentation of their community's history that's been systematically erased from official documents. So my dissertation work, I can honestly say, is a small part of that.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with Thea's stance on abolishing the idea of analytical distance. But yeah, and I would say what you know, presenting my research findings to my communities looks like is really involving them in that process. So I use really participatory analysis methods. So they were a part of arriving at the research findings. It wasn't a matter of just kind of presenting them to them afterwards. And that was really valuable and really enriched, you know, the knowledge that we were able to co-produce together, right? Because it was truly grounded in the perspectives of the people involved who, you know, I believe are the experts on their own lives. So that was what that looked like for me. Do we want to invite other questions kind of more generally from our audience members?
Yes, if anyone has any questions, you can just go ahead and unmute yourself, or feel free to write it into the chat box as well. I can start with one question. One question would be, do you feel or sense, or you know, that you had any impact through your dissertation work or your work as a Mellon Scholar on the faculty members you work with? Did you challenge them? Do you feel like you had a connection, or you hit some kind of power structure issues? Or what were those relationships with the faculty members you were working or you are working with? Assuming you feel comfortable answering it.
That's a great question, Anna. I can respond briefly and say that, you know, my committee members on my dissertation were really supportive of these kinds of methods and approaches, and allowing me to have also an innovative dissertation format. I did 2 articles and 4 films, which constituted my dissertation. Those films were co-produced with the youth. That being said, and you know, obviously I selected those committee members on purpose because I had long relationships with them and they kind of knew what I was about and what I was doing. But I will say, I know that it ruffled some feathers within not anyone I was directly working with or who had, you know, kind of direct supervision over what I was doing. So it didn't pose a challenge or a threat to my ability to do it. But I know that it was questioned by some of the more, we'll say, traditional type of faculty. But I think ultimately completing my PhD was the biggest like indicator to them that it was like, okay, well, I guess these methods can slide because ultimately they're completing the work, right? It's unfortunate that that's the sort of measure of success, but that was how it functioned in my case.
Yeah, I would say I felt one of the things I struggled with during the 2-year Mellon program was I felt a decent amount of pressure to be able to demonstrate my ability in the more traditional formal analysis methods of art history, and to be able to, be in a room, or however you want to phrase it, with folks that value a very different type of artistic analysis, and also do this work that I care about, and try to bring them together. But I think in a lot of ways, art history as a field might be a little bit behind, anthropology or CCC in terms of familiarity with any of this material that we're discussing. My dissertation advisor was also a Mellon faculty fellow, so I was very fortunate in that respect. But yes, I would say in general, in the discipline of art history, there's going to be a lot of pushback on work like this, in terms, and it always comes back to like aesthetic value, I think. So I mentioned like the curator traditionally being this person that has this expert aesthetic knowledge, and I see that as really one of the foundational things that we need to break with to continue to develop these more inclusive practices for social impact, because ultimately I don't think that you can center that kind of, and the notion of what good art is so rooted in white supremacy and capital. And so I think in that respect, and art history is a fascinating discipline because these are ultimately like luxury objects that are bought and sold today still, and the tie of the discipline to the art market and kind of high finance like that also, I think, keeps the discipline from evolving in certain ways. So yes, I was personally very fortunate that I didn't receive any pressure, on this project, but it's something that I anticipate coming up against as I, move forward as a scholar.
I want to say that my project really shifted the way that I relate to faculty in a profound way. And I want to hold up Ryan and at the time James for being really super open to deep critical conversations about what we were doing and being really above board about the fact that this was a new project and there were a lot of questions open to it. I felt so respected and so listened to throughout that whole process. And I felt like me and the people in my cohort had like a really meaningful voice in shaping what the program was going to look like. And that really was an experience early in my graduate studies that helped me understand that I also am an agent inside the university. And that really has shifted how I approach conversations with people in my department, how many of my colleagues in the program have engaged in collective action to change the university. And I think the Mellon Program is no small part of that growth for me.
I guess I'll chime in and say that both of my advisors were definitely supportive of the Mellon Fellowship and my work with Ashe Culture Art Center, primarily because of the career goals that I expressed early on. Being in the conventional history department, but I have the aspiration to, if a tenure track job becomes available, to get appointments in the history and the African American Studies department and institute. So the interdisciplinary nature of the Culture Arts Center was something I couldn't actually get from my history coursework. During my time, I'm a candidate now. I haven't taken any African American anthropology, sociology, psychology courses. So the experience that I got at Ashe allowed me to, again, put the traditional writing to the side and actually find something practical to do with my hands and to fix, to create I guess you could say, a link between the community.
So I think, yeah, we can still take other questions, and it also, we might return to the questions Dr. Murphy posed. I think if anyone wants to speak kind of around this question related to funding and being launderers or converters of those funding streams, right? For social good, if you will. I'm sure that my colleagues have thoughts to share around that.
Yes, and it's interesting because this is something that I have, a parallel that I've thought about frequently in the reading or the learning that I've been doing about social innovation, is thinking about parallels with certain contemporary art practices. that kind of exist in this parasitic way of diverting funds from universities, from these massive arts foundations to communities. And I think that is such a foundational question in so many ways, because particularly with museums, and the Newcomb Museum, part of the reason it had the ability to make shows like this is because Newcomb doesn't have a board of trustees, isn't funded necessarily by the private philanthropy of whichever oil exec at the moment. And so I think that is a key question, particularly for museum work, is just how can we take these funds and be parasitic and do something meaningful, but also not get too comfortable with the source of this funding. And that's something that's starting to be talked about a lot in New York, particularly. So there have been recent protests about MoMA board members, for example, with ties to Black Rocks, with ties to fossil fuel companies, but also, arms manufacturers. And so people are starting to that has become a key issue is trying to get museums to divest from these sorts of funding sources. So there's multiple levels, I think, where the funding question comes in, at least in terms from this museum perspective.
I don't really have an answer, but I have a story that I'll share that this question made me think of. So a large part of my work focuses on the indigenous Maya in Guatemala. And I was doing a project related to youth migrants who are members of the Maya community who had been deported back to Guatemala and what their experiences were. I was doing field work down there. This was probably, I think it was my first semester at Tulane, like the summer after my first year. I was pretty fresh and definitely feeling a lot of imposter syndrome and grappling with what it meant to be back within the academy. After I lived in Guatemala for 2 years, and so this was my first time back, and I was conducting this project and spoke with an immigrant activist who was a member of the Maya community down there doing incredible work with returned migrants. And shared with him that I was interested in exploring these topics and that I was a student at Tulane, and he was really kind and open with me, and we had just an honest conversation. But somewhere in the midst of it, he kind of mentioned, you're here on a grant from the Tulane Stone Center for Latin American Studies, right? And I said, yeah, that's where my funding came from. And he's like, yeah, I'm familiar with them. I also know that they have a big Latin American library there where a lot of our Maya texts are housed that my people don't have access to, and our languages are at risk of being lost. And meanwhile, the kind of elite white students who are attending that institution, and that institution itself owns these books, and how do we navigate that, basically, was kind of a question that he posed to me. And my my response at the time, and I kind of stand by this, I don't know why, it's what came to me, but we ended up kind of talking through this, and I gave him, I don't know if I should say this, but I gave him my library login to Tulane, and and I was like, let me share this resource with you, because yeah, you're right, we house all of these things and you don't have access to them, and that is unjust, that is fundamentally unjust, and how do I redistribute this resource in a way that feels really immediate? And that might have been not the most ethical choice in some regards, but it felt like the right choice at the time. And I think that was something that he appreciated. But it made me think really about how we grapple with the source of funding, with the ownership of knowledge, with who has access to the knowledge that is produced and extracted from the communities we're working with, and what I can do as an agent within the university to change that. And sometimes those things are small, but that was what it made me think of. So I just thought I would share.
A great story. Thanks for that. And the other, appreciate it. I'll just pipe up. I'm really, really intrigued by any thoughts you might have about the role of funding, because I was thinking of what Megan said about museums and philanthropy, and it's, I think Shana, who's leading Antenna now, and their and Fossil Fuel Fest, and making a decision to not take any money from, is it Hello's Foundation that takes money from? So in other words, is it good or bad? Like, what do we do with all that money floating around that has come from nefarious places and is guiding universities and making things happen? And it's a big part of social innovation. How can you capture that for good? I'm curious if you have more ideas about how we ought to do that.
I agree that that's an extremely contentious question. And there's an interesting thing that's happening. You know, I as a way that maybe I'm trying to think about the clearest way to articulate this. You know, I work at this intersection of cultural heritage preservation and environmental planning for communities that are often at the margins of both things in terms of state and federal processes. And an interesting thing that you see is that some of the very institutions that are responsible for the dispossession of historic communities are the ones who are paying to preserve information about them. So anybody who's seen the movie about Mossville will be familiar with, you know, this settlement that was, you know, first founded in the 1700s that grew tremendously during the Reconstruction, and that was displaced by the apartheid South African oil firm Sasol, which then bankrolled the Mossville Oral History Project after everybody was gone. Right, and conversations like this come up a lot for people who are living in communities who are dealing with this. Shell also, very contentious funder of historic, you know, information stuff. And I think that like these are conversations that people are having who are doing the work, who are like living in communities. And again, I think, you know, this maybe points to one of the friction edges for us as academics who, like you rightly point out, Laura, are the beneficiaries of a lot of this funding for our own pursuits. But to be there in those conversations and hear how they're playing out and hear how they're moving forward. And I don't think there's always a super simple answer. Another thing that I want to which is what you're saying, obviously. The other thing that I've just am thinking about is with Mellon, with my Mellon project with Jane Place, you know, a big like part of what they do and what attracted me to them was their commitment to locally directed, fully affordable, sustainable housing that ultimately, like through a community land trust model that they were doing with the vision of the city ramping it up once it was a successful program. So building things for public institutions to replicate once you can show that they work. And a big part of the way that they do that is through housing and urban development block grants, which are one of the most evil things when it comes to public housing. But is this innovative way of using it for anti-capitalist housing development. And so I think maybe by way of offering one answer and not talking forever is listening to people who are doing organizing work about how they envision subversive ways of using that funding and really focusing on that, because a lot of the times in the world of the nonprofit industrial complex, we're going to be pushed to see legitimate actors as the people who have power in that world and the people who are spending the money in the ways that Mellon or Kellogg or Kresge or, you know, whoever envisions that money being spent. And almost always that's not what we want.
Thank you, really interesting.
So I think if we don't have any further questions, we might just wrap up here. If that sounds good to everyone, or if anyone had closing thoughts, I guess I'll invite those now.
Wish I would be doing my PhD now, not, you know, 13 years ago. Sounds like more fun. Wish I would know not what I, you know, so much I didn't know then. It just seems like I'm learning every day, which is great. I feel like I'm learning more now than I was learning when I was doing my PhD.
Mm-hmm.
My English is a little bit better too, so that could be a factor as well. But I'm really excited to hear those stories and what you are going through. And I think it's really, really incredible work. So thank you for sharing.
Thanks, Anna. I have a, I don't know, a minute observation actually. I really appreciate your projects, your dissertations, the different trajectories you're taking. I did my PhD many years ago and have been undoing it ever since then. And I just appreciate that you're kind of trying to transform the academy and put it to good use. And I think that's great. It's a 1,000-year-old institution that started, you know, with men being trained for the Catholic Church, right? It's come a long way, and I think we can do more. So I'm just curious to, keep talking about what we can do within the university, outside. What I try to show is the pictures that social innovation is a whole space of action that's happening, whether we look at it or not from the academy, those things are happening. But I think might offer some useful theories or frameworks or evidence, and so we'd happy to talk more about that. And meanwhile, I look forward to following your research more and learning more, and thank you for sharing your time and your work.
Yeah, thank you all. It was wonderful to see these connections between the vast fields we're working in and the ways we're bringing that to bear on our community activism and the issues we care about. Thanks to all of my colleagues for presenting and sharing. And again, Diana just put in the chat the link to our Mellon program at Tulane. So if you are interested in learning more, please check that out and get involved in whatever way makes sense for you. Diana, do you have something you wanted to close?
Yeah, I'd like to add that, so the top link is a link to the application. We're currently recruiting all three levels of engagement, the graduate student fellows, the faculty fellows, and the community leader fellows, which all go in the same cohort. So each year we have a cohort of 12 graduate students, 4 community leaders, and 4 faculty members. That makes a cohort of 20 people working together for, as you heard, from for the following 2 years. Additionally, I have a link to the WordPress that we have, the Mellon, the other link underneath, and that one has more profiles of other Mellon graduate fellows and other cohort members. So if you're interested to see, what other projects are out there, who else has been a Mellon Fellow, there are some wonderful stories, and of course, we'll be happy to hear any feedback. Maybe Ryan, do you want to drop your email in the chat as well, in case you have any, any questions related to the program as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. This was fun.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Great
you.
day.